Well, hello, and welcome to Bio 211. You're in AMP1 at Norwalk Community College, and this is one of the sections there. And what we are in, and we are in Chapter 6, and what we're doing is we're looking at bone. How do you actually build bone tissue is where we started. And when we last spoke, what we had done is we had done a sort of comparison and contrasting of how it is osteogenic or compact bone is built in these repeated arrays of concentric lamella with a centrally located blood vessel as well as lymphatic structures. And inside this osteon, we have a repeated array of osteocytes that are inside of a lacuna that actually has projections of that cell communicating with the other osteocytes that are adjacent to it, relative to over here, which is where compact bone ends in this preparation of the bone, and you're going to see this different type of bone. We call it trabecular bone or spongy bone. Okay? You're going to see that in this space, you actually have fluid that surrounds the trabecular structure, and you actually have osteogenic cells that are surrounding this. But inside the matrix, you have osteocytes that are found inside of the lacuna. Notice there is no central vasculature here, which means perfusion and diffusion has to be enough to keep these cells growing forward. Having said that, spongy bone within each trabecula are within the trabecula are lacuna that contain that osteocyte, and these trabecular bone structures are oriented along the lines of stress. And this is really important, right? Because without trabecular bone, you don't withstand forces that are linear all that well inside of your body. Okay? So this is Mother Nature's way of making sure that bones that would otherwise, imagine if you were jumping up and down, if you didn't have this trabecular bone deposited where it's supposed to be, then you wouldn't actually be. So now that you understand, that the spongy bone is responsible for withstanding stresses without breaking, let's think about why Mother Nature would do that. Well, for us to actually understand what bone is doing, we want to think about the fact that, remember, here's bone, and remember, deep to bone is superficial to bone is a periosteal membrane. And remember, what needs to be fed underneath that are osteogenic cells. So the way that Mother Nature actually does this is she takes blood vessels and she puts them through foramen, and foramen are the holes, and they move. What happens is they now move toward that periosteal membrane. So she needs to create an environment where these are going to be safe as they travel. And what's going to happen is Mother Nature is going to figure out a way to have them grow in a specific pattern. Now, because your bone is broken up into structures, here's that articular cartilage. And by way of pop quiz, what is articular cartilage made up of? Deep to it is that epiphysis, and this would be the proximal epiphysis of the tibia. And what you're seeing is, here's that epiphyseal line for that bone, and there's a metaphysis below that. And you notice the amount of trabecular bone inside that space. So we actually break up the bone so that you actually have diaphyseal or periosteal arteries, okay, as well as epiphyseal arteries. Thinking about the epiphysis here, Mother Nature breaks up the responsibility, and you'll see why when we actually build bone in utero. Okay? So notice, in this case, it's not traveling to the actual periosteal membrane. Okay? So how does that stay alive? How does that compact bone stay alive? It should be one of the questions you're asking. Okay? But you'll notice here, what happens is it travels out to that space and literally grows right back into the bone itself. You'll see how that happens. We're going to talk now that we actually have blood flow and we have these generic shapes of bones. And you'll notice we never talk about what types of bones are built in which unique ways, other than we're going to grow flat bones or long bones. And generally speaking, bone formation is that ossification and calcification situation we were talking about. So that ossification is bone formation occurs in 4 situations. In embryo, growth of bone continues in adulthood. You remodel bone and or you repair the fractures of bone. So this is the ossification. The calcification description is when we actually take calcium and phosphate out of the interstitial fluid and make a calcium phosphate collagen matrix. Okay. So how does it happen in embryos? Cartilage formation and ossification occurs during roughly the 6th week of embryonic development. And we start off with flat bones. Your textbook does this, I think, probably more out of ease than anything else. And what's going to happen is, one, you're going to develop an ossification center. Okay? That ossification center literally is mesenchymal cells become trapped in this space that differentiate into osteoblasts. They make and lay down the matrix, and you'll notice what's happening is they are laying the matrix down around this collagen fiber. So this is actually called a membranous structure. Okay? And as this becomes more and more ossified, you're going to find that there are specific parts of your skull. If you literally go to the back of your, say, your occipital bone, you can feel there's a occipital prominence, right? These are the thickest areas of ossification inside those specific bone plates. And what's going to happen is we're now going to move to the fact that we are calcifying, okay, the entire space. And you're going to see that you have this ring now of osteoblasts that are moving outwards. I'll draw an arrow here for you. An arrow, and they're moving outwards. And these are supposed to be arrows. Sorry, I didn't put things on them. And they're moving outwards away from where all of this is happening. And what they're doing, of course, is they're trapping each of those osteoblasts that are now osteocytes inside of the lacuna. And notice how they're all attached to one another using canaliculi. Okay? And this is going to move outward in a light wave-like manner. And what ends up happening, of course, is you end up creating a mesenchymal layer that will become the periosteum surrounding the bone. And inside of this, what your textbook doesn't really describe for you is that Mother Nature needs blood vessels inside of there. And there's this constant interplay between osteoclasts, which are not even in your cartoon here, and blood vessels to burrow their way through bone. Okay? And you're making now these layers of bone that with time, if you believe this cartoon, are going to be these blood vessel-less structures. Well, blood vessels have to be traveling in here. Remember, all red bone matter, meaning those formed elements, are going to be made inside spongy bone tissue, so they have to get in and out somehow. But for right now, what I want you to see is you have this layer of compact bone on a flat bone on both sides. And you have a periosteum on both sides. Okay, the periosteal should be on the outside. This should be called endosteum, but you'll notice your textbook doesn't even name it for you. Okay? Last thing that I want you to see is that in the middle you can actually see, depending on the bone type, so in this intramembranous bone formation, all right, you, inside of a membrane, intramembranous, we create the ossification center that we then use calcification to make this thing radiate outwards. Think about flat bones of the skull, the mandible. These are all growing the same way. Okay? So that you end up with compact bone surrounding trabecular bone surrounding compact bone, or compact bone is on the far side to that. Okay. So, if this is intramembranous bone ossification, let's get rid of that cartoon. That means you have those flat spots, or, we call inside lab, you're going to see that the soft spots are these indentations. And what they really mean is that's the membranous structure that's still left behind as the bone plates have still grown towards one another. Okay? But it is in contrast to endochondral ossification, which actually comes in 2 phases, where you replace cartilage, fully formed cartilage, models, precursor structures of bone inside of your body. And that's what you see here. You actually create the perichondrium. Notice the suffix here, chondrium, meaning collagen is going to be used. And inside this perichondrium surrounded structure, we have hyaline cartilage. And inside that hyaline cartilage, we have a proximal epiphysis, a diaphysis, and distal epiphysis. And what happens is the calcified matrix arises because there's no blood vessels that are supplying that hyaline cartilage. And because of that, what happens is a nutrient artery moves into the central portion of the diaphysis. And what's happening is osteoblasts are moving with it. So you have, and osteoclasts as well, but your textbook doesn't talk about that too much. And they end up remodeling this entire central diaphyseal portion. And your textbook has it drawing to this place right here, which will eventually become this epiphyseal plate. And it's still uncalcified matrix. Okay? But you'll notice nothing is happening at the proximal, and if they drew it in for you, the distal epiphysis here. And what's happening is they're replacing it first with spongy bone at the most superficial layer as you're moving inward to outward. Notice what I said there. You're moving inward to outward here. Okay, well, you get the idea. What's going to happen, of course, is that once we actually have formed completely this diaphysis, notice now they should have put in here a periosteal membrane. There's the periosteum there. Periosteum to periosteum. Okay, and it's traveling all the way around, but you'll notice it's not traveling to where the epiphyses are. So now you can see where that articular cartilage is going to come from. And similar to what we saw here a moment ago, inside the diaphysis, the lack of blood perfusion to the space causes a calcification. That's the signal now for ossification to begin inside that space, where that epiphyseal artery and vein and whatever else needs to move into that space will allow for us to make only trabecular bone in this space. So it's separated by this epiphyseal line, supported with this epiphyseal artery and vein. Okay? Now, this means you actually have articular cartilage, spongy bone, epiphyseal plate, spongy bone on the other side, but now notice you have the compact bone here. So what's the significance of this? Well, the significance is this. You actually now have what's called a growth plate, and that growth plate literally will be replaced by bone tissue at the epiphyseal plate. And what happens if here's the diaphysis of bone, here's the zone of resting cartilage, what ends up happening, let's put an arrow in here for you, is that you end up growing towards this. So resting cartilage becomes proliferating cartilage, meaning it grows rapidly. And because it's growing rapidly, remember there's no vasculature there, so therefore it becomes calcified. The pH shift causes this, but don't worry about that. As it becomes calcified, it's now going to be remodeled into trabecular bone, which will then be replaced by compact bone. But notice what I'm doing is I'm showing you the directionality of the growth from the zone of resting cartilage towards the diaphysis. Notice your epiphyses and your bones don't get much larger. It's only the diaphysis of the bone that's going to grow larger. Okay, so in adolescence, let's get rid of that cartoon. In adolescence, you're going to see that what's going to happen is here, it's growing towards the new diaphyseal area there. What stops this growth is estrogen. So that's a hormone. And estrogen you'd think is only found inside females, but it's actually not the case at all. So as you get to a specific age, the amount of growth that can actually happen from this epiphyseal plate, okay, is limited by the expression of estrogen. Okay, if you don't have a lot of this, you're not going to be tall. If you express estrogen in high concentrations, you're going to be short anyway. You get the idea of what's going on here. Okay, at adulthood, those epiphyseal plates closed, bone replaced, all the cartilage, and part of the signaling system that's responsible for that is estrogen. I'm going to put that in here. Remember, oops, MEMBER, estrogen, estrogen. Okay. Now, in the course of our lives, from infancy to childhood and adolescence, bone is going to grow both in terms of thickness and we will remodel it, meaning as it's growing in length. We just saw with the epiphyseal plate, it grows in length. If we need bones to grow thicker, we have to activate the thickness at that periosteal membrane. We'll come to that in a minute. Anytime we actually change stress on the body, increase the mass, decrease the mass the bones have to carry, it will reform bone. There's an ongoing replacement of old bone tissue by new bone tissue, and old bone is continually destroyed by osteoclasts, and it's replaced throughout an individual's life. You limit the amount of calcium phosphate you take into your body, you limit the opportunity for bone remodeling to occur. So that means there has to be a balance. And of course, you know, I hate to use the word balance inside this class because Mother Nature really is thinking at the end of the day, how much energy do I have to expend to make sure this body doesn't fail? That's the way I would tend to think about it. Okay, so if there's too much new tissue formed, bones become too thick and heavy. If there's not enough okay, then they're weak and brittle, okay? Rickets is the example that's given inside your textbook, and maybe inside class, if we have time, I'll explain that to you. But essentially, rickets was the description of you didn't have enough calcium phosphate, and there was incomplete processing of collagen inside the cells that are making and excreting collagen, okay? Okie dokie. So where are we going to go with this? Well, how do we actually generate the factors, or do we understand the factors that are going to regulate bone growth and remodeling? Obviously, if you don't have any calcium and phosphate inside your diet, you're not going to be able to remodel bones. To a lesser extent, you need magnesium and fluoride as manganese, okay? And they're all required for bone growth and remodeling. And the interesting part is, of course, all of these things are incredibly dangerous molecules if you eat 10 tons of them. Okay, you need magnesium, you need fluoride, you need manganese inside your diets to maintain the minerals inside your body at the appropriate ratios. Now, vitamins. Vitamin A stimulates the activity of osteoblasts. Vitamin C is required for the synthesis of collagen. We should say correct synthesis, because you can make plenty of collagen, but if it's not processed properly, it's not going to function. Okay? Vitamin D is to help build bone by increasing the absorption of calcium foods and from the gastrointestinal tract. Remember, UV light, UVLIGHT, converts vitamin D to calcitriol. Calcitriol. Okay. And vitamins K and B12 are needed for the synthesis of bone proteins. They're also needed for the synthesis of red blood cells. We'll come back to that later. Okay, what hormones are required? Well, during childhood, the most important hormone required for bone growth are the insulin-like growth factors, okay, because it stimulates osteoblasts at the epiphyseal plate and enhances protein synthesis. Think collagen formation. Thyroid hormone is also required to promote bone growth by osteoblasts, and insulin promotes growth by increasing the synthesis of proteins, and that actually means uptake of amino acids, okay? Because without it, you can't have enough amino acids to build all the proteins that you actually need. So this is, I'm going to go to here and I'm going to say, okay, so this is probably if we're thinking about the most difficult processes to think about in Chapter 6, it's how do hormones actually work? And the way we talk about these things is we introduce this idea that you can have estrogen and testosterone that are going to cause dramatic changes of bone growth during, say, puberty, okay? Such as widening the pelvis or a rapid growth rate, and therefore you have incredible growth at the diaphysis. Okay. Also, estrogen shuts down growth at those epiphyseal plates for both males and females, which means both males and females get estrogen and testosterone, and this is what's actually going to cause the growth. More importantly, we want to understand that parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, and calcitonin also affect bone remodeling, and this is what I'll finish up with before we go to what happens when you break a bone, right? So, parathyroid hormone, PTH, is made inside the thyroid gland, and what it does is it causes osteoclasts to break down bone, so you increase EASE calcium in bloodstream. So let's just go, BS stands for bloodstream. Okay. Calcitriol is going to be responsible for, so calcitriol is going to be increase in Ca absorption from food. And calcitonin, what calcitonin does is calcitonin deposits more calcium and phosphate into your bone. So you can see what's happening here is you've now created this sort of dynamic. Depending on what is required, parathyroid hormone will target osteoclasts, okay? Because it's going to break down bones, so you have more calcium inside your bloodstream. Whereas calcitonin is going to target osteoblasts, and those osteoblasts will now trap more calcium and phosphate inside of your bone. That calcitriol, if it's not present, it means you don't have more calcium inside your bloodstream to absorb anyway. Okay, so that's a great place to stop. We can do one more for chapter 6. Bye.